Okay, so as promised, today we're going to look at the Rambam's view of the Gemara we learned yesterday, which is the question of how we view rabbinic mitzvahs, rabbinic mitzvahs and what's the validity and why we make a bracha. So first I just want to make a comment on something we talked about yesterday. So we mentioned two views, one the Rambam, which we're going to look at today, which is it's an extension of the biblical commandment to follow the words of the sages. And therefore the blessing we're saying is, blessed are you, Lord God, for commanding us to listen to the sages who commanded us to light the menorah. That's the way the bracha should be understood. And we gave the other view that it's the sages themselves that are empowered to divine for us what it is that God wants. So I split it between Ramban and Rambam, which is generally true, but I want to make just a caveat. I realize that I have to clarify this. Ramban himself doesn't at least clearly articulate his position. What he really does is just argue with the Rambam and say why the Rambam, he poses a number of questions on the Rambam's opinion that rabbinic mitzvahs are an extension of Lo Sasser. And he explains that in his view, Lo Sasser, this commandment not to deter from the words of the sages, is not a reference to biblical commandment, not a reference to rabbinic commandments, but an extension of the way in which the sages made a fence around things, for example. So he just, disputes the Rambam, but doesn't clearly articulate his position. The way in which I articulated it, that it's divine power invested in the sages to tell us what Hashem wants, that's already commentaries explaining the Rambam's position, Ramban's position, the B'chanan Wasim and others. Anyway, I just want to make that caveat, but it's not as if the Ramban clearly articulates that it's a spiritual investment from Hashem into the sages. This is the way we understand the Ramban, because the Ramban disagrees with the Rambam and doesn't clearly articulate his position. Okay, just want to make that clear. So now let's see the Rambam itself as we promised. Now, I mentioned yesterday, this is a can of worms that we can spend the next 10 classes on this, going through all the various different views on exactly how we break down the sages' commandments and when do we say that the sages are doing in doubt, and when the sages are putting a fence, and when the sages are giving us a new commandment. All of these things can be analyzed and overanalyzed. For example, I'll just throw in one thing. We mentioned yesterday, I'm throwing this in because it's going to come up a little bit when we learn the Magid Mishna. You mentioned yesterday the distinction between novel commandments, in which the sages said, on certainty, this is what Hashem wants, versus on a doubt whether you fulfill the commandment. Right? So how do we understand this doubt? Is that a new instruction from the sages? In which case, you're still fulfilling the biblical obligation of fulfilling their command. Right? But we're separating them though. Right? This is not an extension of the sages saying, this is not an extension of the sages using their power as given to them by Torah that we have to listen to their instruction, but this is the sages putting a fence around a biblical commandment. If that's the case, it's not a rabbinic thing at all. It's a doubt of biblical proportions. Did you fulfill the biblical commandment or not? So it's not a suffix divreihem, as the Gemara put it. It's not a doubt of the sages. It's a doubt, did you fulfill the biblical command of giving Meiser or not? So it's not any more rabbinic thing anymore. It's a biblical thing. It's a question of doubt and biblical thing. Right? So why wouldn't you make a bracha, not fulfilling the sages' command, but a bracha because maybe you fulfill the biblical command? This is something that's taken into consideration when we talk about these various different opinions, right? Because once you're parsing between sages' command versus when the sages say putting a fence, then we have to look at the fence not as a rabbinic command, but as a doubt. Did you fulfill the biblical command? Certainly, when it comes to Demai, where it's not even a fence, it's maybe the guy didn't even take Meiser, maybe the guy didn't take his tithes. In which case, the question is of a biblical one, not of a rabbinic one. Following where I'm going here, there's an extra nuance here. Follow that? When the sages say to keep Chanukah, right? It's not as if they're worried maybe you violated a Torah command. It's an entirely novel command. Keep Chanukah. Even though, of course, it has its roots in the Torah, as the Gemara tells us. But it's a novel command, essentially. But when the sages say, we're not sure if this guy gave tithe, therefore you should give tithe. Is that a new command from the sages? No. The command exists already to give tithe. We're not sure if the guy gave tithe. So why is it even a rabbinic command? It's a doubt of a biblical command.
What's the command exactly?
To give tithe.
No. The doubt is.
Did the guy who you bought the produce from give tithe yet?
Right.
So then when I give tithe, yes, but what am I doing here? I'm doing it because perhaps the biblical command wasn't fulfilled. So it's not like the Gemara says you don't make a bracha by safek divreim, right? The way the Gemara articulated it was, there's a difference between vadai divreim, a certainty that the sages said, you shall do this, versus a doubt of the sages. This is not a doubt of the sages, this is a doubt of the biblical. Did you fulfill the biblical command or not?
But the doubt is on the person.
So what? But the doubt, it doesn't make a difference. It's not, yeah, well, that's true. There is a different distinction between a doubt in the object versus a doubt in the person. But either way, why I'm doing this is not because a sage is commanded per se. I'm doing it because I want to make sure I fulfill my biblical command. Right? So it's not exactly the same. Okay, let's just keep that in mind as we go look at this. Okay, but so now let's see the Rambam. Let's see the Rambam. So we have to see, let's see what the Rambam says. Okay, so let's look at the Rambam's text there. This is in the laws of Chanukah. Actually, the laws of Purim and Chanukah are together in the Rambam. First, there's four chapters to that section. The first two sections on Purim, second two sections on Chanukah. So this is chapter 3 of these chapters, but it's really chapter 1 of Chanukah, right? Because it's the second two of that section is the first of Chanukah. So chapter 3, section 5. You have it there in the English and the Hebrew, I believe. So I'm looking at the Hebrew, but you can look at the English. From during each of these days of the 8 days, one says the entirety of Hallel. And he makes a bracha before he says the Hallel. The bracha he says, blessed are you, God our Lord, who has sanctified us with his commandments, and you commanded us ligmor as Hallel, to conclude the Hallel. But we say al kriyas Hallel, which is another discussion, why it's ligmar as Hallel versus kriyas Hallel. But anyway, we say likra as Hallel, to read the Hallel. But here he says the language is ligmar as Hallel. And if you're making a bracha to thanking Hashem for the mitzvah of saying Hallel, ben yachid, whether he's an individual, ben b'tzibur, whether he's in a minyan. Also another discussion when you're doing full Hallel versus half Hallel, minyan versus individual, also for another time. Now, for our discussion, even though this recitation of the Hallel is only a rabbinic commandment, nonetheless, you can still make the blessing and cite the words, for you, God, have sanctified us with commandments and commanded us. Just like you do when you read the Megillah, which is a rabbinic commandment, and when you make an Eruv, which is also one of the rabbinic commandments. And likewise, Chanukah menorah, which we just finished talking about. Because anytime the sages said of a certainty that this is what you shall do, you make a bracha. But something which is commanded to us by the sages. See, the Rambam does an interesting thing. It's commanded to us from our sages. But the primary reason why you're doing this command from the sages is because of the doubt. You see, so he's avoiding my issue. It's a doubt that you fulfill the biblical command, but it's the sages who instructed me to take care of my doubt. Right? Going, for example, Ma'aser D'mai, giving the tithe from this D'mai. D'mai, again, it was mentioned yesterday, is you buy produce from someone who is not reliable, and we don't know if he took the tithe. You don't know if he took the tithe. So it's a doubt as to whether or not the biblical command has been fulfilled. And the sages came and said, do it out of the doubt, right? So it's not like any time there's a doubt of it's an interesting thing, because when there's a doubt whether or not you fulfill the biblical command, we tell you to be stringent always. So what's unique about this? It's a mitzvah where the sages said, cover yourself in your doubt, whatever exactly that means. Meaning, why do you need to command the sages? It's a doubt whether you fulfill the biblical commandment. That's good enough to do it. But there's an interesting kind of mixture here, where there's a doubt of whether or not you fulfill the biblical command, and therefore the sages are telling you, cover yourself on your doubt. But so that kind in which you're fulfilling the sages of the command, yes, indeed, it's a command from the sages. But the commandment of the sages is built on a doubt of your mitzvah. Ein mevarchen alav no bracha. Okay. Now, if so, why do you make a bracha on the second day Yom Tif? Right, this is from our Gemara yesterday, right? Why do you make a bracha on second day Yom Tif? Second day Yom Tif is a doubt. We're not sure which day was Rosh Chodesh. Ancient times when they relied on the sighting of the moon, and you're living in Canada, you don't know what day the Bezdin declared in Yerushalayim Rosh Chodesh, and therefore we keep 2 days, so it's a doubt, and yet we're making a bracha. And here, it's also only because of a doubt. And we just finished saying that when the sages give you a command to cover yourself on a doubt, no bracha. And here the sages are commanding you to keep second day Yom Tif out of a doubt, and yet we make a bracha. Answer, Kadei Shelo Yizalzel L'Boy. So that you shouldn't take it lightly. Now here's the interesting thing. The Gemara gave yesterday 2 answers. Right? Look at the Gemara. If you have the Gemara in front of you. Here on the screen, I put up the Gemara here. Yeah, there should be the next one. I think it's just before 2 dots. Right? I'm looking at the Sefaria here. I think it's just before the 2 dots there towards the bottom. The Gemara asked this question, Yom Tov Sheni, the subject of Remu, but the second day of Yom Tov is a doubt. Uboy bracha, and you need a bracha. Says the Gemara 2 answers. Hasam, number 1, so that you shouldn't take it lightly. That was the answer that Rambam gave. And Rabbi says, Roiv Amei Aretz, the majority of the majority of people, even those who are ignorant, even those who aren't observant, ma'asin, they do take their tithe. Right? And Rambam takes the first answer, which is that really, when it comes to a mitzvah of the sages based on a doubt, you don't make a bracha. The only reason why by Yom Tov Sheni, even though it's a doubt, you're making a bracha is because we don't want people to take it lightly. Because people will take the whole second day Yom Tov lightly if they didn't have to make a kiddush.
They could take it lightly if it wasn't designated. In Israel, it's taken lightly.
It's not taken lightly. It doesn't exist in Israel.
There you go.
Taken lightly means that we observe it. But people walk around thinking it's no big deal, and we just won't keep Yom Tov the second day. We'll write the show on Yom Tov, second day Yom Tov, or wherever. We'll turn on the light. That's what it means taking lightly. Not that we ignore it. Ignore it means in Israel not taking it lightly. It just doesn't exist. Right. So we're talking about here in Canada. If we didn't have to make kiddush second day Yom Tov, we wouldn't think of it as a Yom Tov b'chlal. We would just we would say, okay, whatever, the sages said to do it, but we're going to skip it. We're not going to keep Yom Tov today. That's what we're concerned about. Because in other words, the observance of Yom Tov is so tied up to making kiddush and having this whole meal that if we didn't do that ritual, we would just say the whole thing is not a real Yom Tov.
That would be kind of true.
And that's why the sages said make a bracha, even though the whole thing is built in a doubt. So really, by doubt, by mitzvahs of the sages that are built in a doubt, whether or not you fulfill your biblical obligation, we don't make a bracha, with the exception of Yom Tov, because we're worried people are going to take the whole Yom Tov lightly if they didn't have the ritual of Kiddush. Okay, now let's see the Magid Mishna. Okay, so over there you can see it's in the bottom there. Keep the Gemara handy, because the Magid Mishna is going to run through the Gemara for us, and then he's going to point out exactly how the Rambam learns the Gemara. You don't have the page? The Gemara. Okay. Says the Magid Mishna. He quotes the Rambam, which is Api Shekriyas V'chulu, even though halal is only rabbinic, nonetheless we make a bracha, and the reason we make a bracha, he says because it's a certainty. Now here he doesn't say it, but in his introduction to Sefer Mitzvahs, he explains that it's because of Lois Sasuru. Because it's Lois Sasur, because Torah says because the sages commanded us to follow the instruction. The Torah commanded us to follow the instruction of the sages. That's the way Rambam says it. He doesn't say it over here in this halacha, but that's the way he learns it elsewhere. Okay, let's see. This is well known that we make a bracha on halal. And in the chapter of Mematlikin, which is the chapter we're learning in the Gemara, Shabbos Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, Shabbos 23a, which is what we learned yesterday and we just reviewed now, where there it says, Shalu, the Gemara asks, with respect to the law of Chanukah, with respect to the bracha on the menorah of Chanukah, where were we commanded? Rav Avya said, Miloi Sasser. It comes from the verse which says, thou shalt not stray from the words of the sages. That's where the mitzvah comes to light the menorah. Rabbi Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, the other pasuk, which was Sha'ala Vicha V'Yageitcha, ask your father, he shall tell you, your elders, and they shall inform you. And that's where the command is, to listen to the sages. Two different verses for the command of the sages. A few different verses which say that Hashem wants us to listen to the words of the sages. The Hikshir of Amram, and Rav Amram asks in the Gemara, he's reviewing the Gemara for us. Masha Amru, by the way, I mentioned yesterday that the Magid Mishna is the Beis Yosef. I mixed that up. The Kesef Mishnah is the Beis Yosef. Sorry? Kesef Mishnah is the Beis Yosef. I mixed it up. The Magid Mishna, as you see, I wrote there who is very little is known about him. All we know is that he lived in France. And we know when he lived, as you can see there. Rabbi Vital, what's the full name there? Sorry? Yeah, Vital of Toulouse. Okay. We don't really know much about him. Anyway, the Hikshir of Amram, and the Gemara asked, Rav Amram, the Gemara asked, on the fact that the Gemara stated that we make a bracha on mitzvahs of our sages. And the Gemara objects to that by saying, Midatanan, from the fact that we say, Hamad Demai, when it comes to Demai, when it comes to produce bought from someone who we're not sure if he took the tithe, and therefore there's a doubt as to whether or not you fulfilled your biblical commandment. And the Mishnah there said, Ma'arvin boy, you can use it to make an eruv. I'm not explaining this again because we explained this yesterday. Mishtatfin boy, and you can use it for the eruv of the alleyway, not just the eruv of the courtyards. Umavorchan alav, and you can make a bracha hamoitzi on it. Umizamnin alav, and you can make your zimun. You can do that rabbi before benching. And the main point for our discussion is, mafrish noisei aram. You can take that tithe, which the sages commanded you to take, out of a doubt as to whether or not the guy you bought it from took it. You can do so without any clothing on. That's the primary line for our purposes. You have to. That's the command. The command of the sages is when you buy produce from someone you're not sure if it took tithe, you must take tithe. That's the command. And this Mishnah is saying you can do that command without clothes on, implying no bracha is made. Even though it's a biblical rabbinic command, take the tithe from the Demai. Following Demai is the word to describe tithe, produce you buy from someone who you're not sure if it took tithe. And the sages commanded, take tithe from the Demai. And here we have a statement saying you can do so without your clothing, implying no bracha. That's just part of the same text. It's part of the same. Before we took tithe, yes. After you took tithe, for sure. No, it's if it's a biblical command, if it's your produce from your backyard, then before you've taken tithe, you can't do anything with it. You can't use it for eruv, you can't use it for anything because it's not edible. Right? So over here, there's a leniency because it's only a question of a doubt, and it's only a rabbinic commandment to take that tithe, therefore we can use it for an eruv. Right? This is what we explained yesterday. But the main point for our discussion is the fact that you can do so without clothing. Exactly. Fulfilling this command, take the tithe from this doubtful produce, you can do so without clothing, which means you can do it without, or you don't, which means there's no bracha required, which therefore would imply that even when you're fulfilling a rabbinic command, no bracha. Yeah, that's another element that's true. That's right. It's another detail I never mentioned. That's right, which is that the halacha is that if you're poor, then you don't have to. Well, this is to explain the eruv part, not really the bracha part. Not the bracha, but the eruv part. It explains the eruv part, which is a detail I didn't mention. Anyway, the reason why you can use it for your eruv, seemingly it's not edible. The sages commanded you have to take tithe, right? In order for the eruv to work, it has to be edible. It's not edible if you haven't taken tithe yet. So how could you use it for your eruv, even though it's only a doubt? But nonetheless, the sages commanded that you can't eat it until you take the tithe. So how could you use it for your eruv? The answer is, as Rabbi Gilpel just noted, that Mr. Rashi mentions that the halacha is, If someone is destitute, he's completely poor, then he's allowed to eat demai. The sages said you take the tithe only if you can afford it. If you can't afford it, you don't have to take that tithe because it's a doubt anyway, right? Because maybe the guy who bought it from did take the tithe, right? Following? So because a poor person could eat this food, and you in theory can make yourself poor by rendering all of your property ownerless, and then you would therefore render that tithe as edible, and that's why you're allowed to use it for your eruv. It's a detail not related to our subject per se, but it's an important detail.
And that's the reason why of the leniency, because theoretically someone could.
That's why it's using it for your eruv is not a question of leniency. It is a question of leniency, but the leniency is not you can use it for your eruv. The leniency is that a poor person can eat it. A poor person can't eat produce he made in his own backyard and to take tithe. If you made produce in your own backyard, and not you, God forbid, somebody made produce in their backyard, he's completely destitute, this is the only food he has, he's still not allowed to eat it until he gives tithe, because it's a biblical command, take tithe, right? And therefore he could not use that for his eruv. The leniency is that a poor person could eat the demai, because it's only a doubt. And because a poor person can eat the demai, therefore you can use it as an eruv, because you can make yourself poor.
Which means that by extension, anyone could use it.
Correct. They could render themselves poor. Correct. Correct. They can, disavow all of their property, with the exception of that little produce, making himself effectively poor. Right? Even though 2 seconds later he'll reclaim all of his food by walking into his house and eating. Nonetheless, at least for those minutes when he makes the eruv, he's poor. Right? Okay. The main point of our discussion here is that this demai, the fulfillment of this rabbinic command to take tithe from this uncertain produce, one can do without clothing, and therefore the Gemara says, continuing in the Magid Mishna, and if you're of the opinion, as the Gemara suggested, that when you're fulfilling a rabbinic command, you have to make a bracha. How could you make such a bracha when you're without clothing? You have to be holy, as we explained yesterday. You have to cover your nakedness when you make a bracha. And how could the Mishnah say that you're allowed to take this tithe from the demai without clothing on? Seemingly you need a bracha. And therefore, it's Abaye. And Abaye answered this by saying, Vada de Devrehem, that when there's a certainty, the sages told you something to do out of a certainty, like Hallel, Chanukah, Menorah, not a doubt issue. Maybe you should observe Chanukah. No, you shall observe Chanukah. Then by bracha, you need a bracha. But Safek Devrehem, but when it's a doubt of the sages, and again, as we saw from Rambam, it's not a doubt of the sages. It's a doubt whether you fulfilled your biblical command. And the sages commanded you to cover yourself in your doubt. Right? It's a doubt whether or not the biblical command was fulfilled. Then, no bracha is required. Now, the Gemara asked on this answer, we're reviewing yesterday's Gemara. But the second day Yom Tov, which is a doubt of biblical, is today Yom Tov or not? And the sages commanded us to cover ourselves in our doubt and keep the second day Yom Tov. The Kam of Archina, and we make a bracha kiddush. We make kiddush. We make a bracha. V'tirtzu, and the Gemara answers, Ki heichi d'lo lizilzavu, that really, on a question of a doubt, on a question of a doubt, you should make a bracha. I'm sorry, you shouldn't make a bracha. On a question of a doubt, you shouldn't make a bracha. But here, we're worried that people are going to take the whole Yom Tov, second day Yom Tov lightly. Exception to the rule. But the rule, generally speaking, is, this is where the Rambam learned, right? This is how we learned from the Rambam. So Rambam went with Abaye's line of reasoning. But Rava Tiritz, now here's how the Magid Mishna learns the Rava. Listen to this, very interesting. But Rava Tiritz, and Rava answers, this is the second answer, which says that majority of people do give tithe, and therefore it's not a doubt, it's only a stringency, right? Remember that was the second answer from the Gemara? Which question is he answering? Is he answering why? Well, what's he answering? Which question is he answering? So we learned yesterday, Al Tiritz Kushat Admai. He's coming to address why it is by Tamai you don't make an answer, you don't make a bracha. Right? And Amar Rava said, that the majority of people do take tithe, which means, effectively, in Rava's opinion, when the sages commanded you to cover your bases on a doubt, would you make a bracha or not? Yes. The only reason why you don't make a bracha is because majority of people anyway is giving your tithe. And it's only a stringency, it's not a doubt. But when the sages commanded you to cover yourself for your doubt, you do make a bracha. In Rava's view. This is how we learned the Gemara yesterday. Right? And this is so far being substantiated by the Magid Mishna, this reading of the Gemara, and from Rambam. But now that the Magid Mishna is going to introduce another way of reading the Gemara, in which Rava is not disputing. Rava is not disputing, right? The way we learned the Gemara, and so far from Magid Mishna and from Rambam, it seems like it is a dispute. According to the first answer, where the reason why you're making a bracha on the second day Yom Tov is because it's an exception to the rule. Ordinarily, doubt mitzvah, when the sages command you to cover yourself in a doubt, you don't make a bracha, like demai. And the reason why you're making a bracha on a doubt of a second day Yom Tov is because we don't want you to take it lightly, right? Which the premise, therefore, is that when the sages commanded you to cover your bases on a doubt, make a bracha. Second answer was, no. When the sages tell you to cover your bases because of a doubt, you do make a bracha. So why by demai are you not making a bracha? Because demai is not even a doubt. Because the majority of people do give the tithe. That's the dispute between Rava and Abaye in the way we learned the Gemara, the way that Rambam seems so far, and the way the Magid Mishna explained it. In the second case, it's not a doubt. Yeah, it's not an exception to the rule. It's not part of the rule. The rule is second day Yom Tov. It's a doubt. Command Torah. The sages said to do it. Make a bracha. That's the rule. Demai, not part of the rule because it's not even a doubt. Because 90% of them, 99, whatever the majority is, do take the tithe, and therefore it's only a chumrah, it's only a stringency, not a doubt. Okay. This is the way we understood the Gemara yesterday, and so far it's being substantiated. But now the Magid Mishna is going to introduce a new way of reading the Gemara. And this new way of reading the Gemara is itself controversial. There's a very long Lechem Mishnah on this, which gives a different reading of the Gemara. And the Lechem Mishnah does introduce the Ramban, but obviously we're limiting the amount of worms letting out of the can. Okay, so let's at least introduce one more reading of this Gemara. Just because, why not? It's always good to get broaden our horizon. Okay, so there's a little break from our usual custom here of sticking to the most basic meaning of the Gemara. That's been our practice here. We stuck to the basic meaning of the Gemara, introduced halacha, and introduced Chassidus when we could. But now we're breaking a little bit and seeing a little bit of a pilpul, a little of a different way of learning the Gemara. Okay, let's see. The Das Rabbeinu Maga'onim Zal. Now, the opinion of our teacher, Rambam, so the reading the Gemara is about to tell us is Rambam's view. We just read Rambam in the first view that Rava and Abaye are arguing. And that Rambam is ruling like Rava, that doubt mitzvahs you would make a bracha, and second day Yom Tov is the exception. That's how we just learned the Rambam. That Rava and Abaye are arguing, and Rambam's taking Abaye. Magid Mishna is about to tell us that Rambam actually goes with a different view, based on the Gaonim. The Gaonim is an era of scholars, of which there is not much writing, but the writing that they write is very, carries a lot of weight, I suppose. That's a good way of putting it. And the Rambam is very much in line with the Gaonic tradition. The Gaonim is the post-Gemara age, but before the prolific writing of the Rishonim. It's during the era when Jews still had a centralized, right? There was centralized rulership in Eretz Yisrael, obviously. 1 second. There was centralized ruling when the Jews were still in Israel in the Second Temple and then post-Second Temple, right? With the house of the princes, right? With Yehuda Nasi on that line, right? The house of the princes. They were a centralized body that ratified law. And then it shifted to Babylonia, to Bavel, in which there was centralized learning there under the Reish Galusa. The Reish Galusa means the head of the exilarch, the head of the exile. There was some controversy during some period during the shift between Israel and Bavel. The sages of Israel claimed that so long as we're living in Israel, it should come from Israel, not from Babylonia. But at any rate, it shifted. And that's where the Gemara is written and ratified. After the Gemara is ratified, there's still quite some time where the Jews do have a centralized authority in Bavel until it fully is integrated into exile, in which there's no more centralized body that determines law, especially as a split between Ashkenazi, the French community, French/German community, versus the Sephardic, the Spanish community. As that split becomes more and more acute, obviously the centralization of halacha becomes less powerful. because it doesn't exist. So the Gaonim is the post-Gemara age before the breakdown of the centralized learning. The word Gaon was reserved for someone who was the head of the academy. So you had effectively two leaders then at this period. You had the Reish Galusa, the head of the Exilarch, who was mostly a political figure, although he also had a weight of Torah. And then you had the Gaon, which was the head of the yeshiva, the academy. Saja Gaon, High Gaon, Tzemach Gaon, different Gaonim. So this is what he's referring to here. It's still under the centralized body, but post Gemara age, which is why their writing is very sparse. But there's only one book of Chuvas Gaonim. It's a small book of responsive from the Gaonim. But there's other writings, like for example, this is when Jewish philosophy starts to really take shape and be articulated as in this period, basically with the writings of Saja Gaon. Anyway, the Rambam very much stuck to the tradition of the Gaonim, both in philosophy and in halach, as opposed to the Ashkenazic writers, which may be a little less reliant on the strict word of the Gaonim, and they'll go straight to their interpretation of the Gemara. This is a very generalistic statement, but I think overall it's true, at least from my limited knowledge. No? I think that's overall correct. Okay, so says the Magid Mishna. Das Rabbeinu, the opinion of our teacher, the Rambam, V'ha Zal, and the Gaonim we just talked about, Lefarish, to explain that Rabba loy ploy g'hai tamid Abaye. Rabba is not arguing with Abaye. Abaye, who said that when there's an issue of a doubt, and that's where the sages commanded you should make a bracha. Sorry, who said you should not make a bracha? And the only reason why you're making a bracha by Yom Tif is because it's an exemption. We don't want people to take it lightly. And Rabba, who said that Demai is the kind of doubt, which is not even a doubt because most of them do it, they're not actually arguing. And the reason is because we learned in brachas, the Gemara in brachas, that Safek Kara Krishma. I want to pull up the Gemara here. Oh, they don't put the Gemara here. Okay. At any rate, where am I? Went too far down. Okay, here. So the Gemara says in brachas, the details of the case, they're not so important, although I wanted to pull it up, but I failed to do that. Maybe we'll do that in a minute. Safek Kara Krishma. We're in doubt as to whether or not the person read Shema. Safek Loy Kara, we're in doubt if he didn't. Eino Chayzev Kara Krishma. He doesn't go back and read Shema. My timer was the reason, because Krishma Drabanan. Because Shema is rabbinic. Okay, this is a good question. We should know. Let's look up the Gemara, because as we know it, Krishma is biblical. Right? The reading of Shema is biblical. So let's pull up the Gemara. Brachas, what does it say? Chaf Aleph. Right? What is it? Sorry?
21a.
Chaf Aleph Mud Aleph, 21a. Let's pull up English, Hebrew. Okay. Yeah, this is an opinion that says that it's only rabbinic. Yeah, it's one opinion which we don't follow. Okay, it's one opinion there. The bottom line is that in this opinion, you don't review it because it's a doubt. So Alma, what do we derive from here? Kol safek devrayim. Anytime there's a doubt of the sages, loy boy meheder ubruchi. You don't have to go back and make the bracha. Now, if that's the case, then Demai, which is a rabbinic doubt, also not go back and make a bracha. Are you guys seeing? I hope you see a challenge now on this statement I just made. No. Assuming it's a doubt, what's the problem? We just finished. Magid Mishna proves from the Gemara, right, that if it's a doubt of the sages, you don't go back and do it again, make a bracha. From the Shema, this opinion that Shema is only rabbinic. What? The issue is because what Demai is a biblical doubt. Is that what you just asked? Shema is biblical. No. In this opinion, Shema is rabbinic. In this opinion, and because it's rabbinic, in that opinion, you wouldn't go say it again if you're not sure. So we're proving here that the doubt of the sages, you don't go back and do it again. What's the challenge? Meister is not Demai is not a doubt of the sages. It's a doubt of the sage of the Gemara. of biblical proportions. This is one of the Lechem Mishnah's challenges to the Magid Mishna. Right? And we actually learned that way in the Rambam itself, which is what the Lechem Mishnah does. But let's see how the Magid Mishnah himself learns. At any rate, the Magid Mishnah is maintaining, based on this Gemara, quoting from the Gaonim, that because the Gemara says over there that according to that opinion, which Shema is the Rabbanon, you don't go back and say Shema again. And therefore it's a proof that when there's a doubt of the sages, you don't go again. You don't make the bracha again. Which means it's a universally accepted fact that when there's a doubt of the sages, no bracha. And therefore it's universally accepted that Demai doesn't get a bracha. Both for Rava and Abaye. Right? At the time of the Rava, so that's the case. So what's Rava's reasoning? So what's Rava's even popping up? Okay. One second. So Rava, which said that the reason why the Rava says that the reason why you don't make a bracha on Demai is because majority of people do give meiser. That's why you don't make a bracha. When seemingly you don't need to go that far. The fact that it's a doubt is enough reason not to make a bracha, right? Because we just proved from the Gemara in brachas that according to the opinion which says Shema is rabbinic, you don't have to go back and say Shema when it's a doubt, which means doubt of rabbinic is enough to say you don't have to make a bracha. So why does Rav have to say that it's because the majority of people do give Demai? We said the reason is because he's arguing with Abaye, but now we're maintaining that it's not an argument with Abaye. He does agree that doubt mitzvahs you don't make a bracha. Following the conundrum here? One second. That's our challenge to the Magid Mishnah, but that's not the Magid Mishnah's statement, right? In Magid Mishnah, they're both equal doubts. The doubt of Meiser is equally rabbinic as the doubt of saying Shema in that view. You and I just made a distinction that this is a doubt of sages versus a doubt of biblical, which is indeed what Lechem Mishnah challenges. But sticking with the Magid Mishnah's view, that the doubt of whether the doubt of Demai and the doubt of saying Shema, according to the opinion that says Shema is rabbinic, is the same exact doubt, which means that you don't have to go so far as to say that the reason why you're not making a bracha by Demai is because the majority of people are giving tithe. The fact that it's a doubt is enough of a reason not to make a bracha. So if so, why did Rava introduce this idea that the majority of people are giving tithe? So explains the Magid Mishnah. Time of the Rava, the reason of Rava is Kivin the Tikn Rabbanon. Because the sages established it. The Gozrel Admai, they made it a decree that you have to take the tithe from Demai. It's like an actual mitzvah of the sages. And therefore, they should have made a bracha. They should have said to make a bracha. So this is interesting. In Rava's view, it's something like this. You have biblical commands that are like Chanukah and Purim and Hallow. A new command. That's a vada de devrayim. That's a certainty of the sages. This is what God wants you to do. Fine. Make a bracha. Then you have doubts. Doubts like second day Yom Tov. And we established that doubts, you also make a bracha. Now you have a new category called Demai, which starts out as a doubt, but the manner in which the sages enacted it wasn't as a fence, make sure to cover your bases. But the sages enacted it as if it was a mitzvah like Chanukah and Purim, even though the premise is doubt. Following? In which case, why shouldn't you make a bracha? Why shouldn't you make a bracha? Why should you not make a bracha? If the sages are, if the sages are making the mitzvah of Demai, just like Chanukah and Purim, even though it happens to be based in a doubt, but now that it's established as a mitzvah, it's a mitzvah like Chanukah and Purim, so instead of 7 mitzvahs of the sages, it should be 8 mitzvahs of the sages. That's more of a direct commandment. Even though the premise starts out in a doubt, it's become a direct commandment. It's such a subtlety, and like, why would you go this way? But this is the way they learn. So why aren't you making a doubt? Why aren't you making a bracha? And therefore Rava says, only because the majority of people already give ma'aser. So if the sages wanted to give you a sign, it's not to think that the sages are telling you that this is like a biblical command. It's very, very, so let's walk the whole thing through. it starts off as a doubt. We're not sure if the person gave tithe. On an issue of a doubt, no bracha is made. Why are you making a bracha by second day Yom Tov? Rava in Magid Mishna's view agrees with the Abaye answer because you don't want to take it lightly.
That's it. Stop right there.
No, but 1 second, because we want to maintain. No, because Rava introduced this idea. You could stop right there, which is what Abaye would say, right? The question is why Rava goes a step further. Assuming that Rava agrees with Abaye that in cases of doubt you would make a bracha, and therefore second day Yom Tov is an exception. So why did Rava go a step further and say that by D'mai, majority of people take tithe? Why do you have to go there like you're saying? Stop there, right? Which means Rava has to introduce a new element. What's this new element? The new element is that D'mai, even though it's predicated on a doubt, is really just like Chanukah and Purim. Because when the sages enacted, they didn't enact it as a fence around the biblical, they enacted it as a freestanding commandment. If that's the case, why aren't you making the bracha? If it's like Chanukah and Purim. Therefore, I've asked to introduce this new notion that it didn't even start out as a doubt. It started out as a chumrah. The majority, because the majority do give meiser. And because the majority give meiser, right? Therefore, we want you, the person taking the tithe, to know that what you're doing right now is not a biblical command. And in order for you to know that, we tell you not to make a bracha. Because had you made a bracha, you would think that this is a fence around the biblical command that the sages are telling you to do. But we don't want you to think that way. We want you to know that it's an independent rabbinic command, which ordinarily would make you make a bracha. But we want you to know that this rabbinic command is only rabbinic, not biblical, and therefore no bracha. So for the same reason that Chanukah and Purim get a bracha, D'mai doesn't get a bracha. Chanukah and Purim get a bracha because it's an independent command. No one's going to confuse Chanukah with a biblical command. Why would you not confuse it with a biblical command? Because there's no words in the Torah that say Chanukah. But had you made a bracha on D'mai, you might confuse it with a biblical command. Because here the sages enacted it. You know, because the action's the same. The bracha would be the same. Right? The bracha would be the same. Blessed are you, God, the Lord, who has commanded us to take meiser, to take tithe. So the bracha would be the same. And you would be taking this tithe, and you know from the Torah that you have to take tithe, so you would think it's an extension of the biblical command. So the sages want you to know, no, this is a rabbinic one, and therefore no bracha. But it's the kind of rabbinic command that has the same validity as Chanukah and Purim, not the kind of command which is like the opinion which says that Kriya Shema is a doubt. Following? It's quite Sorry? There is a bracha, a biblical tithe. But for D'mai, you shouldn't do it because we don't want you to think it's a biblical command. In other words, you're a guy who we don't want you to think D'mai is a biblical command. You're a guy who has produce in your backyard. See, you've made the bracha on Meiser 100 times in your life already. Because you know it's a biblical command. And now you bought produce from a guy you don't know about. And you're told that you have to take tithe. Now, if you made a bracha, you have to take tithe again now. Right? Because you bought it from someone who's a doubt. Right? Now, when you make the bracha, because you've done the bracha 100 times before, you will assume this is the same mitzvah. And the sages don't want you to think that way. And if they said, don't make a bracha on this, because the majority are doing it anyway, and we don't want you to think it's rabbinic, we don't want you to think it's biblical, so don't make a bracha. Yeah. There's so many questions you could ask on the Magid Mishna, and I hope they're all flying in your head. I hope you're asking all these questions in the Magid Mishna. There's lots and lots of them. For example, why wouldn't the same opinion apply if the problem is we don't want you to equate the D'mai with your biblical mitzvah, because how you make a bracha on both of them, you would equate the two. Why is that dependent on the fact that the majority of people take tithe? Even if it's 50-50, the same problem would be there. Would it not? If it was 50-50, you wouldn't make a bracha anyway, because it's a suffix, because it's a doubt. Right? In this view. So you already have the differentiation. Well, let me put it this way. What?
You mentioned that you fall back onto the original, which is subject to right.
But you make a bracha on something d'oraisa l'chumra. You maybe give tithe, but you make a bracha.
No, because of the right. It was like another case. It was the rice. You may have to go back
And do it again.
Yeah.
But not a bracha.
The brachas are
Brachas are rabbinic to begin with, right? But let me put it this way: in Rabbi's view, that the commandment to take D'mai, the commandment to take tithe from D'mai, has the weight of Chanukah and Purim. Let's say it was 50-50. Sometimes, let's say it wasn't the majority of taking tithe. Let's say it's 50-50 of people you're buying to take tithe.
Like not the mind. The person wasn't sure himself.
So you would take it again without a bracha. Yeah.
Okay.
If I'm not sure if I took tithe on my produce, I'll take it again without a bracha. Just like if I'm not sure if I put on film today, I put it on again without a bracha. Right? Because that's always the case. Now, let me just articulate my question here. If, in Rava's view, the command to take tithe from D'mai is as weighty as Chanukah and Purim, right? And the only reason why you're making the bracha, the only reason why you're not making a bracha is so you shouldn't confuse it with the biblical command. Then what's the difference if it came from a majority of people who took tithe or 50-50? The point is, the sages enacted it as a new command: take tithe. Or another way of saying this is ha'ikar chasam and ha'sofer. Rava's primary statement is missing from his words. The words he says are, because the majority of people give tithe. That's the words he says. Whereas in Magid Mishna, what's the operative statement of his opinion? The operative statement is the sages enacted tithe as a full-on command, and we don't want you to confuse it with the actual biblical mitzvah. The fact that the majority of people take it is almost inconsequential. No, because to be a heker. What's the difference if majority or not? If the Chachamim tell you to do it as weighty, walk it through. Let's say it was 50-50. And we're still going to go with Rabbi's opinion that you're doing this as a command like Chanukah and Purim. But it's not a suffix anymore. It's a mitzvah like Chanukah and Purim. If you could take, 1 second. If you're taking Rabbi's view, that the Gzeda of D'mai has the same weight as Chanukah and Purim, then the issue of making a heker is irrelevant to how many people take tithe from D'mai. And that's my question.
The answer is because since the majority that do take Meiser, so then it's the kind of a weekend takana. It's kind of yes, not strong enough to make a bracha.
But it's not what Magid Mishna says. The Magid Mishna doesn't say that the reason why you're not making a bracha is because it's weaker, because of heker. Continue going. But why? What's the heker? That you shouldn't think it's like daraisa. What does that do with how many people take it? The point is you shouldn't look like daraisa. So say it again.
It wouldn't be considered like a rabbinic argument.
If what?
Rabbinic commandment, if you're talking about the 50-50 issue.
That it would be rabbinic. So I think what you're saying is, this is what I think the answer is. The reason, the proof to Rava, not like this. Rava is stating a fact. The fact is the majority of people do give tithe. It's just a fact of life. Now, the fact that the majority of people give tithe, and yet there's still a command from the sage to give, indicates that the command is as weighty as Chanukah and Purim. Had there only been 50-50, if that were the fact on the ground, that it's a doubt of 50-50, then there's no proof that the sages did it for any other reason than to guard you from a doubt. But because the majority, in other words, Rav is not, the chiddush is not that the majority of people, let me put it this way. Is Rava and Abaye arguing on a matter of fact? Do the majority give or not give? Either the fact that the majority do give or the majority doesn't give. It's a question of a fact on the ground. Rava is saying, given the fact that the ground and the majority of people do give, that means, why would the sages tell us to give Meiser if the majority give already? Usually when it's the majority, rely on the majority. Just like when it comes to kosher, there's all kinds, depending on the circumstances, but a meat comes from, and the majority of the, depending on the circumstances again, I don't want to go down this road, but the point is, if the majority of the food in this, the majority of stores here are kosher meat, and the meat you find is kosher. So follow the majority. And because the fact on the ground is the majority do give tithe, why not rely on the majority? Why not rely on the majority? And yet the sages still enacted. Therefore, it must be that the enactment here on D'mai is not because we want to prevent you from falling into the pit of violating a biblical, but because it's a new commandment like Chanukah and Purim. And that's why it's important for Rabbi to make the statement that the majority give Meiser. Because that's his proof. That it's not that because it's majority, therefore we're worried you're going to confuse it with the rest of them. No, no, no. The fact that it's a majority is proof that the sage's enactment is not to defend you against falling into the biblical. Because there is no issue of falling into the biblical, because the majority give. And therefore, and yet the sages still came and said to take tithe, which means therefore it must be a new command like Chanukah and Purim, in which case you should make a bracha. Why are you not making a bracha? So you shouldn't confuse it with the other tithe you take. It's still not a perfect reading in Rava, but it still gives you an idea as to why Rava is. In other words, if the main point here, the main reason why you're not making a bracha is because we don't want you to confuse it with biblical. So why doesn't he mention that? He mentions the fact in the ground, the majority don't give. Why is he mentioning that fact? In Magid Mishna's opinion. So it would seem to me the reason why he's mentioning that fact is because that's the fact which proves to him that the rabbinic command is a new command like Chanukah and Purim. Because ordinarily, when the case is that the majority of people give tithe, or the majority of the food's kosher, we rely on the fact that we rely on the majority. And yet sages told you not to rely on it. And therefore it could not be offense. It must be a new enactment like Chanukah and Purim, in which case you should make a bracha. We don't, because we don't want you to confuse it. Right? Now, if we are correct, then it's not only that Rava doesn't disagree with Abaye, but Abaye doesn't disagree with Rava either. If we are going to accept that Rava is not making the novels, that Rava is not arguing with, Rava and Abaye are not arguing about the facts on the ground. Is the majority or not the majority? They all agree on the facts on the ground. The facts on the ground are the majority of people give the tithe. If that's the case, Abaye must agree with Rava also. Because the fact on the ground are majority is giving tithe, and yet the sages still told you to give tithe. Why? It must be a new mitzvah. Right? But the problem is that Abaye still says it's a suffix to Devrayim. It's a question of suffix, a question of doubt, which means they seem to be arguing even on the fact on the ground, which still remains to be understood. Yes, but why would Abaye say it's a suffix Devrayim? Why is Rava calling this a suffix Devrayim? Rava calls this a doubt of the sages. Why? So we understood it to mean, we as in before the Magid Mishna, the way we read from before the Gaonim, the way we learned from in the Rambam himself, and the way we learned in Rashi also. It's not a doubt of the sages. It's a doubt whether you fulfilled your biblical command. And the sages came and said, put a fence. That's how we understood this whole Demai issue. And that's how we separated it from Chanukah. Chanukah is not a fence around the biblical. It's a command. A fence around the biblical. Therefore, it's no longer under the category of thou shalt follow the sages. It's the sages putting a fence around the biblical command. That's how we understood it till now, which is perfect. But then the Magid Mishna introduces this new thing from the Gaonim. And no. When there's a doubt from the sages, you don't make a bracha.
So why here?
And the question, if that's the case, that means Rava also has to agree with that.
Sure.
And because Rava has to also agree with it, therefore Rava has to say that Demai requires a bracha because it's not a doubt issue. It's a new command. But yet you're still not making a bracha because you don't want you to confuse it with the biblical. Whereas Chanukah has no issue confusing it. Now, even though when it comes to day 2 of Yom Tov, there is the issue of confusing it. And what's the proof that there's the issue of confusing it? The majority of people don't realize second day of Yom Tov is anything less than the first day of Yom Tov. Right, so it is confused. People think of the second day of Yom Tov as just as biblical as the first day of Yom Tov, when it's not. And had we not made Kiddush, everybody would know this is biblical, this is rabbinic, which is why we're not making Kiddush. But nonetheless, the issue of we don't want people to take it lightly outweighs the issue of confusion with the biblical. And for some reason, when it comes to Demai, the issue of confusing it outweighs the issue of people taking it lightly.
Because there's a way out of Demai.
Because there's a way out. There's a way out to becoming poor. When it comes to Demai, there's a way out. And therefore people take it lightly. Not the worst thing in the world, because they can get out of it anyway, but legally. But second day Yom Tov, you have no legal way of getting out. And therefore we do not want you to take that lightly. That's the answer. Very good. Okay, so we're introduced to a little Pilpul here. Thank you all for participating. Pilpul is a group effort. So thank you all. This was a lot of fun. Hope you guys enjoyed it. When we'll get back to our regular programming, God willing. Oh, the last line. Yeah, we didn't finish the last line. Yeah. Now, from this whole discussion, the sages derived the suffix milah, that if a person's in doubt as to whether or not the bris was done properly, there's certain amount of skin that has to peel back, and let's say there's a doubt, so you have to go back and do it again. You don't make a bracha because on a doubt you don't make a bracha. And this is in line with the teaching of the Ramban, Nachmanides. But the Ra, Savar, is of the view that Rava Polagada Abaye, that Rava disagrees with Abaye, as we learned it in Rashi. Ularava, in Rava's view, Kol Safek, any doubt, Afilu Darabbanan, even a doubt of the sages, Boy Bracha, you do make a bracha. And the same thing is true of the Ravid, who disagrees with the Rambam, but the Kabbalah but the sages, but the words of the Gaonim is more weighty. So as I mentioned before, because they precede them, even though we learned in Rashi that Rav and Abaye are arguing, that Rav is actually the view that doubt you would make a bracha. And the reason why you don't make a bracha by T'mai is because it's not a doubt. The majority do take. Whereas Abaye says, any doubt you don't make a bracha, which is why T'mai, which is a doubt, you don't make a bracha. Just the simple way of learning Gemara as we did yesterday, that they're disputing. Okay. There's obviously much more, but we wet the beak a little bit into the world of Pilpul. God willing, tomorrow we'll get back to our Gemara. We're almost finished the laws of Chanukah. About a little bit less than three-quarters of a page left to go in the laws of Chanukah. And what do we conclude we're going to do after Chanukah? We talked about this before. Which tractate are we doing after we finish the laws of Chanukah? Didn't we discuss this? Go back and watch the videos. We discussed it once, didn't we? We didn't come to a conclusion. We just concluded that we're going to do Chanukah because Chanukah is coming up.
I think, Rabbi, you mentioned that you were thinking of Sota, and then you weren't sure.
Yes. We talked about Sota. Sorry? Oh, we didn't come to a consensus.
You didn't come to a conclusion. You mentioned Sota, but you didn't come to a conclusion.
But we didn't come to a consensus. Okay, so let's put some thought to it, and we have a few days to decide before we finish this Gemara.
We listen to you. See, as you can hear, we listen to all you say.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
God should bless you. You go from strength to strength.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.